alone in the basement last night. I never believed basements held secrets beyond bad insulation and the occasional misplaced hammer. Last night, though, when my power flickered and the heating clicked in a way I hadn't heard before, I went downstairs to fetch a flashlight that I was certain sat in the top drawer. The stairs smelled of cold concrete and old cardboard. The bulb above the workbench swung like a small ship at sea, throwing the familiar in unfamiliar directions. Sudden corners, faces out of the grain of plywood, a sense that the room had been waiting for me. The drawer was empty. I remember the precise moment disbelief folded into a slow tightening at the base of my skull. Then, on the bench where the flashlight should have been, sat a small recorder with its red light dim, as if exhaling. I did not own that model. My fingers hovered over it with the automatic, unthinking caution reserved for things that might startle you awake. When I pressed play, a breath unfurled from the speaker. The sound was mine, or a stranger's impression of me, hesitant, finishing a sentence I had not spoken yet. The recorder offered fragments: the scrape of a shoe across concrete, a drawer opening, the soft sigh of tape settling back into its case. Between those unremarkable noises, there were words, my words, uttered with a cadence I recognized. Grocery lists, private jokes, the names of streets I never said aloud. They were clipped, looped like items on a shelf, delivered as if someone had cataloged me the way you tag books. Each phrase landed like a small accusation, too familiar to be comforting, and too specific to be a coincidence. I moved through the basement with a careful domestic choreography, checking the furnace, looking behind the old boxes, patting the cracked paint of the metal door, expecting the logical explanations to materialize. Drafts, rodents, an old neighbor's prank. The house answered with silence, layered over silence. Dust displaced itself in small clouds at my feet, and somewhere beneath the hum of the furnace, something shifted like a conversation, finishing in low vowels. The portrait, leaned against the far wall, seemed suddenly placed with patience, its eyes catching the bulb light like a held breath. On impulse, I opened a taped box. Inside were neatly folded newspapers, an old sweater, and a notebook with dates written across the margin. The dates corresponded to weeks I remembered, but had not thought noteworthy. Small repairs, phone calls, a dinner moved to Tuesday. Someone had been cataloging ordinary things, mapping the quiet geography of my days. The line between observation and possession blurred. Each labeled box felt less like a storage unit and more like a ledger kept by a patient, methodical hand. I laughed, a thin thing, and blamed sleep or electricity, because people prefer an explanation that keeps them sane. I pocketed the recorder to listen later and climbed the stairs with the weight of its truth in my jacket, a device that sounded like me and had been used like a mirror. Upstairs, the house felt different. The hallway painting hung a hair lower, the mug on the counter not in the place I swore it had been. Small errors, I told myself, the pliable evidence of an off night. Yet when I turned the knob to the kitchen, the light above the sink flicked once, twice, then steadied as if accepting the lie. Back down, I brought a screwdriver and a purposeful calm I hoped would dislodge the uncanny. I began to examine the house the way you might inspect a throat for a lump, searching for the foreign object that made everything hoarse. Under the workbench, I found a narrow track scratched into the concrete, fine as a fingernail line. It led to where the portrait had been propped. At its base, the concrete had light bruises, like someone had leaned there often enough to press memory into stone. The presence in the room was no longer only implied, it left trace. I took the portrait down. The frame was modest, the photograph inside older than the house around it. The eyes did not follow me, not in any cinema shorthand, but the face held a small familiarity, the tilt of a chin I might have seen in mirrors once, the same worry lines etched into an expression that felt like mine at 40. Slipped behind the frame was a thin slip of paper with a single word in a steady, small script: remember. It read like an order and a bedside prayer, and it hummed in my head like the note of a held instrument. I had not been alone in this house long enough to accumulate a dossier. Friends joked about the previous owner, a man who had kept meticulous ledgers and peculiar hours, but I had never met him. The recorder, the boxes, the portrait, what irritated me most was how calm the arrangement had been, as if someone had set a place at a table and waited for me to sit down. I began to imagine patience as a kind of craft, the slow, patient weaving of someone's attention into the very fibers of the house. I listened to more tape that night, belatedly aware of how much I relied on my own voice for proof. The recorder repeated things I had not realized I said aloud. Absent-minded mutterings in the shower, how I told the cat to stay when the doorbell rang, the odd unfinished phrase when searching for a word. Then, layered beneath those recordings, there was a quieter track, breathing, near and measured, timed to my own. It was as if someone else had learned to breathe with me in the dark, matching each inhale so nothing in the room made a sound without two partners. The next morning, my neighbor waved from his yard with the habit of friendly mundanity, asking if I'd slept well. I lied. People are generous with explanations when others are present, horror like small, private rooms. That afternoon, I tried to set a trap, a small camera pointed down the stairs, an alarm I set to chime if it detected movement. I returned with coffee and a heed that felt ridiculous, almost theatrical. The house accepted my efforts with the dispassion of a thing that had endured many human gestures and had outlasted their urgency. At dusk, the camera failed. The footage glitched into a smear of gray where the stairs should be, a static bloom that left the motion detector blinking a steady green. The alarm's chime had never sounded. Instead, later that night, I found the coffee cup on the bench below empty, but warm as if after a pause, and beside it, the camera lay where I had set it, face down and wiped clean. Whoever or whatever had visited chose to be seen only by the small, private proof it left in the margins. It had been polite enough to make me wonder about intention. The house developed a rhythm. At noon, the furnace would exhale. At 3, a slow creak spoke from the back wall. At 12 past, the light bulb would sway a fraction and settle. I mapped these movements like a cartographer, making friendly notes in the margins. Small knock by pipes Tuesday, Box shifted 2 inches Thursday. Mapping felt protective, an act of naming the uncanny. Yet the lists were incomplete in a way that made me suspicious of my own memory. The house kept secrets that always required me to remember twice. Then one night, I followed a sound that wasn't there. It began as a hesitation at the lip of hearing a near-silent scrape, the width of a hand across a table. The basement had been dark. I held the flashlight low, letting its cone hunt. At the bottom of the stairs, something had been rearranged, the portrait face down, boxes aligned like spine on a shelf. On the recorder, left where I had put it, a new file named only with today's date blinked. There was no timestamp on what it contained, only a pause, then a voice, my voice saying plainly, "Come down." I almost went back up, because "come down" is the kind of naughty instruction that logic insists you ignore. Instead, I sat on the bottom step and listened to the room breathe. The recorder's "come down" had the same cadence as me calling the cat, the same softness as me reading aloud to myself. It did not invite as much as command gently, the way a calendar compels attendance. I understood, in a way that made my mouth dry, that the house had been rehearsing me as someone rehearses a line, until it is perfectly natural. I left the recorder on and stepped into the basement, like stepping into a room I had rented from my own life. The air around the furnace was warmer. The concrete felt like a cooled pan. From somewhere near the stacked boxes came a sound almost like a throat clearing, a small human punctuation. I called out into the dim, the word "who" dropping into the room and landing flat. The answer that came back was not a voice, but a small, precise movement. The portrait's frame twisted slightly, enough to catch the light differently. It was an answer in gesture. I could have left then, packed my life into boxes, and taken the tidy terror back to the street, where neighbors would nod, and the story would be a cautionary anecdote. Instead, curiosity tightened its grip. I sat cross-legged on the cold floor and played everything the recorder held, from the earliest hesitant breath to the last polite instruction. In that looped landscape of sound, I recognized not only patterns, but a patient imitation. The house speaking back the version of me that lives quietly, that does not fuss, that will return to the basement one day with a flashlight and a borrowed smile. The final entry was different. Not louder, not violent, but closer in the small way a whisper is when it's pressed against your ear. It began with my name said clearly, and continued with the kind of inventory only a close listener could make. The keys I kept on the kitchen hook, the scar on my left thumb from a long ago mistake, a joke I hadn't told anyone in months. It concluded with a sentence I had never spoken aloud in any room, but thought often in private. "I am still home." The phrase hung there like a window that had been opened without letting any air in. I do not know whether whatever kept these records meant harm. It never raised its voice, never reached out beyond the courteous choreographies of moving things a few inches, snapping a bulb, or slipping a note behind a portrait. The house had shown me the edges of its attention, as if probing to see where I would recoil. In the end, it offered me a benign, almost solicitous claim. "You are remembered here." The words are not comfort. They are an invitation, and what terrifies me is not that I was noticed, but that I seemed to belong to someone else's careful keeping. When I climbed the stairs that last time, the bulb winked out, and the house settled as if content. I left the recorder where it had been, on the bench, its red light blinking like an eye satisfied with its watch. I closed the metal door with the deliberate click of someone who hopes the sound is enough. Since then, I've noticed small things return to how they were. A painting straightened, a mug where I expected it. But I sleep in a way I never did before. I feel the angles of the house, the way you feel the edges of a photograph you know will one day fade. Alone, perhaps, is a current word.